Our guest today is Woody Zuill, and if you've ever heard the phrase mob programming, that really started with him. Woody's a software developer with over 40 years of experience, and he's the originator of what he now calls software teaming, where the whole team works together at the same time, on the same thing, at the same computer. He's also the co-author of Software Teaming with Kevin Meadows, and he's delivered workshops on the approach on every continent except Antarctica. So if you know anyone down there, hit him up. He's also an instigator of the no estimates conversation, which some of you may have strong feelings about. In this episode, we trace the full arc of how mob programming came to be, from Woody's early pair programming experiments and research in the late 90s through the breakthrough at Hunter Industries around 2012. We get into the concept of team flow and what conditions actually have to be in place for a group of people to do their best work together and effectively collaborate. We talk about how teams around the world have adapted the practice in ways Woody never prescribed and why he never wanted it to become a set of rules. And we close with a really honest conversation about AI and where we are right now, what Woody calls an instant big ball of mud generator, and why the navigator mindset from software teaming might be exactly what we need right now. I always enjoy my chats with Woody, and I think y'all will enjoy this one too. This is episode 4 of Hard Boiled Software with the great Woody Zuill. Welcome, Woody Zuill, to the Hard Boiled podcast. I'm so excited to have you on here.
It's my pleasure.
We've known each other for a while now. We actually did a gig together way back when that involved some ensemble programming and stuff like that. So it's really, really great to reconnect with you here. And jam.
Yeah, I don't remember when we met, but I know we've known of each other and knew each other at least, 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. Time flies. I got to start off with one of the things I most admire about you, Woody, is your presentation style, like how you give conference talks. And I think the first time we met, I just kind of sheepishly walked up to you and you were sitting at a table and we kind of had a quick lunch or whatever, some agile conference. I don't remember which one, but I've watched you give, I will never say it's the same talk, but it's the same title and abstract. And I've seen it go from really amazing to really, really, really amazing. And I think that's such a unique thing. It's really changed how I approach conference talks, because I was always like, you got to show up with a fresh hour. You got to have a fresh, perspective and stuff like that. And when I was watching you, I'm like, no, you can perfect these things over years. Thanks for that, providing an example. But it's kind of unusual in the speaker set. So I would love to know how you came to this idea of iterating, go figure, right? That's a kind of an agile principle, right? But go iterating on your talk and kind of perfecting it, and what your process is in doing that. Because I think a lot of people would really like to.
Well, okay, so
that.
I don't think I'm naturally a very good speaker, and certainly not a conference presenter. But when I first realized I need to be speaking in front of people, I couldn't even get in front of 5 people. 5 people would be like my limit. And I pretty much had to have everything written down and just read it off, because I would just get befuddled and stammer and stutter and forget what I was going to say. And if I stopped, I couldn't get started up again. So I had a lot of problems speaking. But I had to speak in front of people, in different parts of my life, like to speak in front of a planning commission or a city council about I had a business where we would have to get permits for things and stuff like that. And so I knew I needed to learn to do that. So I got some good advice from a few people who were pretty good public speakers. And one of them that kind of came from the same background as I had, in that he was not able to speak in front of people and he had to learn how. So that was pretty good guidance that he was able to give me, which was pretty much only speak about stuff you're really familiar with. So you have to practice over and over again. And then you've got to, this is what he was guiding me to do. You've got to speak first in front of people who are really your friends or really accepting of whatever you do and not going to be critical. So after a few times of doing that, and my first speaking in front of a larger group was probably 100 people at a user group. And that was part of the thing, was that people at user groups, in the old days, we had these user groups, they might call them meetups now or something, but it was a programmers meetup. And I had been asked to give a talk about some programmer topic. Actually, it was the topic I can remember. So I think this was in 1999. The topic was, how do you get a job when they ask for 2 years experience and you can't get 2 years experience if you don't have a job, right? So this was for beginners in programming. And so that was my first talk on this. But I learned pretty quickly that you can't just show slides and read off the slides. And I learned to use the slides themselves to keep me on track. So I was very fortunate, not in my very first talks, but later, to be able to use images that my wife had made for some of her work. And they seemed to really connect with people. And so I used the slides to keep me on track. So if I'm in the middle of a slide and I forget what I'm going to say, I just click to the next slide. And so it's just, oh, I know where I'm going now. It just brings me right back. So there we go. I think that what I learned from initially doing this was there was a lot of interest in the topics I was talking about, and I couldn't create new material for each time I was invited to give a talk. But I have been invited back to conferences where I gave the exact same topic and description or abstract, as you said, several times, sometimes more than several times. I have my favorite topics, and really all that's important to me is what I think extreme programming, the main thing I got from extreme programming, which was we need to make this a human place for us to do our best. So the people working in software development need to be able to be treated in a way that they can function well. And I got into software development as a living in 1999, late 98. Prior to that, I had other businesses, and I was doing a little side work of programming. I started programming in 1982, I think, or 1983. So I'd already been programming a long time. And when I got into software, at first it was like, oh man, this is so great. Everybody's so smart. Everybody really knows what they're doing. And the first contract that I had, it was really good. We got a lot done. We worked very closely, a very tight little group. The second contract I had, and I won't mention the company's name, but it was a huge computer industry company that they were spinning up a new project of 200 people. And I thought, well, if the small company, I had this contract for 3 months at this small company. I said, well, if the small companies know what they're doing, the big companies must really know what they're doing. So I'm going to go see what a big company's like. And I was completely naive. It was not a good place. And that was when I started realizing, and I was just learning about extreme programming and pair programming. And I was just starting to realize that, we need to make this a humane and safe place for us to work. There was so much pressure, and so much negativity, so much, I would say, bad people management practices at this place that I didn't want to work in a place like that. I did spend 6 months there, but then I started looking for much better places to work. It wasn't until 2011-ish, 2012 really, that people started hearing about the things I was doing outside the local. I'm in San Diego, the local San Diego area. And I started getting invited to speak at the bigger conferences where I really had to learn how to speak in front of people. That was a whole different thing. Yeah. I have now been in front of groups of over 1,000 people. And, I would not have been able to do that in 1999. That just wouldn't have worked.
Some combination of deliberate practice, presentation, and then some graphical assist from your partner. You must have a pretty good prenup if you're able to use her IP.
Well, I've used her attorneys. So my wife is a children's book author and illustrator, and her attorneys made a little outline of how we can use some of this stuff. A lot of the things she does, I can't use because it's copyrighted by my wife, but it's published by someone else. And so I can't use that stuff, but I can use preliminary drawings and all kinds of other stuff that she's done.
Yeah.
And
they're
basically
illustrations.
I love her work.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, we're thinking of doing a workshop or a sessions on storytelling because she's pretty good at storytelling, and her process is quite involved. And I've had to learn how to tell stories too.
That's awesome.
Matter of fact, that was one of the first things, and I think it was Linda Rising, but it could have been someone else. I think I met up with Linda Rising when I was first really needing to speak in front of people, and she was at a conference that I was at. And I went up to her and I just said, "Hey, I really enjoy your presentations, and I'd like to get some advice from you about this stuff." And what she had told me was that you gotta tell stories because people connect through stories. Matter of fact, she came to two of my talks at one conference, and afterwards she came and said, "This was delightful, but I didn't listen to anything you said. I just was so delighted by the pictures."
Yeah. It can't hurt, right? We want to
So
pursue every advantage.
yeah, it's like P.T. Barnum, I think, said, "I don't care how I got your 25 cents as long as you're happy that you spent the 25 cents." So,
Yeah.
he used to have a museum in New York, I guess. But I kind of like that idea. It's like, if you like what I did, it doesn't matter how much of my message got across because something will have gotten across.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of message has gotten across. I want to get back to the storytelling stuff, maybe toward the end, because I think that's where your current head's at, and I
Sure.
think that would be a great kind of future state wrap up our conversation. I could talk to you all day, so this is
I love this.
real treat. I want to get into the software teaming stuff. So people will know
Yes.
this by other names like ensemble programming or mob programming, but you've kind of expanded that to software teaming. And I'd just like to from the horse's mouth kind of hear the definition and the nuance and maybe why it kind of went to that naming of software teaming and what it is from your perspective.
I'm turning around to look for a book. I don't know if I've got it right here, but there was a book that came out around 2001 or 2 that was called Extreme Programming Perspectives. And I think it was a collection of papers from the Extreme Programming Conference way back when. I'm
I
pretty
think
sure
I have
I've
that
got it
somewhere
here.
on my
But
bookshelf as well.
it had an article that was called Mob Programming, something like and the Path to XP or something like that. And so these people, and I think they worked for ThoughtWorks, had experimented with groups of more than 2 because there was a lot of pair programming going on in extreme programming. And so they had written about it. I don't know when I read that article, but it was probably somewhere around 2002 or 3 or 4. And at the same time, and the reason it really sparked my interest was I had learned pair programming in 1998, 99. I liked the idea. I started messing with it, and I got good enough at it by the time, let's say, 2003 rolled around, that's how I preferred to work, especially if I was working with someone who was very junior to me, because I was using the technique that was known as driver navigator, which means the person who's trying to lead the thing is not at the keyboard. The other person is. So when I was working with a junior person, they would take the keyboard and I'd say, "Well, we gotta see how this thing works. And we're gonna see how to create a new object that fits into this architecture or whatever." And so that was really useful, highly amplified learning experience. And once I really experienced that, I realized I don't want to work any other way. But it was hard to get people, first of all, to do the driver navigator way of working, which is where I use Llewellyn Falco's. You should interview him if you haven't already. Llewellyn
We'll get
Falco
around to
thought
it.
for an idea to go from someone's brain into the computer, it must go
Yep.
through someone else's hands. Now, you might ask him about how he came up with that, because I believe that was his misunderstanding. I could be wrong, so Llewellyn, forgive me if I'm wrong. His misunderstanding of something he read in the Pair Programming Illuminated book that was written way back when. Anyways, so I was experimenting with a lot of pair programming, and almost at that exact same time, I was taking on the idea that what if we had not just a couple programmers, but also a tester or the product expert? And then I got an opportunity to work in a company where we had been taking on some what I would consider extremely failing work, and we needed to get it back on track. And so I worked directly. We would work on a team. There were two of us teams of 3 people, which mixed up pretty frequently, but a programmer, a tester, and they would call it a business analyst. And that just worked out so well, I started thinking maybe we better try more. And I'd already read those articles from that book, Extreme Programming Perspectives.
Yep.
And I thought, okay, yeah, if they could experiment with more than 3, let's experiment with more than 3. And there was several occasions there during that time, 2005, 2006, at a company I was working at, that we were able to do this. So that was just mob programming. So when we started at, there was the seminal location, if that's the right word, for this becoming the thing it became for me, was at Hunter Industries. And at the same time, I had been doing user meetups, programmer meetups, where we would just say, hey, who wants to join us? We'll get 5 or 6 people up here and we'll write some software. And often it would just be some software somebody suggested, like a raffle system for their user group or something. And I called it mob programming kind of as a joke, just would get a laugh if I were to say, we're going to do pair programming, but with more people. It's like a mob. And I say, so some people call it mob programming. I said, but we have to have some rules in place because otherwise it becomes chaos, because a mob can be chaotic. Mm-hmm. And that was the line that I was using. So by the time we really started doing it, a lot of the people who had been following me and gone to the user groups or meetups that I was participating in, they were also calling it mob programming. And I didn't think it was up to me to change what somebody else had already called this. There were other people calling it like team programming of some sort. And I wanted to call it whole team programming. Because by the time I started speaking about it, by the time I started speaking at conferences about it, we had already realized that it was more than just programmers. We had to have testers, product people, database person, whatever we could get. And so this is where the word teaming. So I'm going to turn around and grab a book just to prove this is not a background. It's a real bookshelf. This book from Amy Edmondson, which I think was written maybe around 2012, right about the time I really started speaking about this, she had kind of coined the term teaming. I'm trying to look at the date in here, but teaming as a way of working together, 2012. So that was my first really official conference talk, I think was in 2012. Once I read that book, and that's a book that I read cover to cover without sitting, I read it all the way through. It was too much good stuff, really closely related to what we were doing. And then I was saying, I wish I had called it teaming. So yeah, such is life. It's not exactly the same thing. It's just her idea of teaming is that we need to be able to work well on a team any moment we're asked to do so, something like that. So there we go. So I started out calling it mob programming just because that was what it was called. But somewhere along the way, I think the first time I went to Europe, in some languages, mob or mobbing can mean to bully or bullying people. And so I didn't like that. And I started fishing around for something that would maybe be a little less of a problem. But, it doesn't matter what words you use. It's going to be negative in some language.
Dude, so, I know all about that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I ended up, so I coined, I think, kind of in a way, an actual term, the hashtag for no estimates. I think it was used once previous to my use of it in Twitter. Anybody remember Twitter? I do. But other than, and it was unrelated to what I had done. So that's something I kind of feel like I didn't mean it to mean what most people thought it meant. I'm not very good at coming up with names.
Same thing. And also, like you said, any name you pick is going to have detractors. Yeah. It's just kind of the way it goes.
So there were 2 things there I wanted to clarify, though.
Okay.
I didn't want the word programming because when I would say mob programming, then somebody who was a tester or a product owner or a UX designer would say, oh, I'm not a programmer, so this isn't for me. This is for the programmers. So I didn't want programming in there. And I'm focused on software. And so I didn't want to use a more generic just teaming, so I called it software teaming. And in my experience, most places I had worked, when I've actually had a job as a programmer, and I had it for many years, they put you on a team, but you never work as a team. You work as solo people who meet to coordinate things and share things, but you don't really work as a team. And I would think of many of the things I've done in my career. Like when I was really young, I worked at a plant nursery. And we would work as a team, like if we're going on delivery or we're potting plants or whatever it was we were doing. This guy grew hybridized plants and stuff. We worked as a team very often. When I played music as a kid, you play in a band, it was a team. I owned graphics companies and did signage. When you go out and install signs, you're working as a team. You don't go out there and then one guy is running the crane. You wait till he's done to do your work. No, the crane and all the other work is being done in the same moment. So real team kinds of work. And then I get into software and they say, you're going to be on this team. And then you don't do anything that I would consider team-like. Yeah.
It's a work group. It's a collection of people. And I think they're
Yeah.
missing out on, I kind of use the German word Gestalt, right? There were the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Like, I feel like that's, when you're doing teaming and you observe those moments, that is when it's taking hold. That is when people are like, oh, okay. Oh, wow. We can do more together than we could do individually. We can do better together than
Yes.
we get better results together, kind of thing,
Now,
But
not
I was
everybody can
chasing
work
that
as a team. Yeah.
True.
Not everybody can get on a team. And then there's some people nobody wants to work with. So it goes in both directions. Some people
Yeah.
don't want to work on a team. Some people don't want them on their team. But I would say this, we can learn to work on a team. And if we give it a good faith try, it's not going to be for a day or two. It's going to
Yeah.
be for weeks or months. I've worked with a few teams, a few dozen over the last 15 years that almost instantly hit it off and made a great team. But most people, it takes time. It could take more than a few weeks, a few months, and we all just need to be willing to be focused on becoming a much better team player, or that's really the wrong word, but a team member.
Yeah.
Team member. Yeah.
We call it team focused player, right? So someone that has skills and abilities and stuff like that, but recognizes the value of bringing them to a more collective, even a small collective,
Yes.
group, set of people. Think, one of the things and you turned me on to mob programming for sure. It came from you. I there's no doubt about it. And I went back and got the literature and read as much as I could as kind of my MO. But one thing that really stood out to me is I became more familiar with the practices or the concept, or it isn't software teaming is really like an aspirational vision, right? And then what came clear to me is that, yeah, we started with mob programming. Yeah, we started with strong style pair and navigator, but then very quickly the team's norms and constraints and how they did work and little experiments and stuff like that would really kind of evolve organically and suit that particular group, which I think is very different. It's like an unmethodology. It's like Scrum has all kinds of constraints and you follow the bouncing ball, whereas this is more like you start with a very simple set of constraints and they kind of evolve outward, more like Kanban-ish or something. But to me, what are some of the kind of variations that you've seen from your perspective, having seen so many groups using this practice or using this philosophy in their work?
Yeah, well, to start off with, I never intended to give people rules, but as soon as you talk about something, then they take it as the rules. Like, oh, you're not doing it like Woody said, so you're not doing mob programming. But all I meant to do is to give a starting spot. I became a Scrum Master many years ago. I was working at a place where we were having a lot of success doing what I would call lean software development. And the management decided we needed to be certified to do that. And they wanted us to become Scrum Masters. And I got my training from Ken Schwaber. Hopefully I'm saying his name correctly.
Yeah, I think so.
But he was, he's one of the guys or the few people that were there who kind of invented or started the Scrum concept. And there were two big things I remember from the training. And it was a 2-day training. There were 82 people in the class, 2007. Scrum was just really starting to take off. This was up in Portland at the Scrum gathering in Portland for that year. And I remember two main things. He said, first of all, whatever I'm teaching you here today, if you're doing this 6 months from now, that's not really what I intend. I intend this to be a starting spot, and you grow and blossom into what works for you. Now, that wasn't necessarily the words he used. I wish I had written it down. But that was one thing I remembered. And then another thing was we did an exercise. It took several hours on estimating, at the end of which we were supposed to go up and support our estimate, at the end of which he said, you are all wrong. There's no way you can know how long this thing would take.
Right.
And I just loved it because I was already speaking on the no estimates idea. I just wasn't calling it that exactly then at little user groups about, how did we work? And this was the way I was working in 2005 and 2006 was, you know, we don't bother doing estimates because things are going to change too much as we start doing the work. I have a set of sayings that I created for myself, and one of them was, it's in the doing of the work that we'll discover the work that we must do. So we don't discover it ahead of time by analyzing. We can figure out a starting spot and we'll learn later. But anyways, there we go. So yeah, things have to evolve. So I never intended for it to be, here's the rules, follow them. I used a rotation, which meant using a timer, which meant the person at the keyboard would change every so many minutes, 4, 5, 6 minutes. I've done it as little as every 2 minutes and as much as every 15 minutes and maybe even longer. But they're all options. But there's other things. So, for example, I did a workshop at a company that was already doing what we were then calling mob programming up in San Francisco. And they already had 3 teams using mob programming. Each one of them had found their own way to do it. One of them used the timer. Another one, they would switch out who was ever at the keyboard when somebody would say, I don't want to type anymore. Or somebody else would say, I'd like to type for a while. And they actually said, the typing is sort of the easy thing here. We can just free ourselves, just follow someone else's guidance, and that makes it easy. The third team, they would pick a thing that they thought they needed to do, and the same person would sit at the keyboard throughout that thing. So if it was like, oh, we got to add a drop down to this page and it's going to have the regions in it, then that person would be the keyboard till that thing was done. And that thing would be done in 5 minutes to 30 minutes or something like that. So there was 3 ways right there. But I really liked what they did. Ron Quartel, he's Quentin. Now he worked with a company up in Seattle, and I went and did a workshop for them. But he'd already started coming up with this idea of using something more like a dynamic teaming situation where you would switch every few days depending on what the work was. And he developed a system he calls FAST, which I think is quite good. It's actually quite excellent, very closely related to software teaming. So there's I think a really good example. And I would say, we at Hunter were limited. We only had a small group of people, and we didn't have 50 people to gather together and see who should work on what. Whatever came our way is the stuff we needed to do. So, and I've seen many other things as well. I like the idea of dynamically adjusting the team based on the work we're doing. I also like long-lived teams where they get to work together for an extended period of time because there's a lot of benefit from that as well. And we build this shared memory that really helps us understand the depth, the holistic point of view of what it is we're doing. There is a thing called team flow. Matter of fact, at the same time I was starting to have to talk about this, there was research that was going on by a guy in the Netherlands. And his paper when it came out, was called Team Flow. And this was actually a very useful thing to me. When that book came out, it really rattled me. The idea of team flow is to have this shared cognitive space and bring the right attitude to it. And you can achieve something like the psychological flow that we have in, that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi wrote about, very well known for. And so that really rung true with me. Now, I read a lot of stuff and I read a lot of research. I don't believe much of it, but my experience told me that this team flow was what we were observing that we had achieved. And even before I read that paper, we were starting to talk about it. But once I read that paper, it was a long couple hundred pages, it really made it clear that we were achieving, and that to achieve team flow, you have to have certain prerequisites. And one of them is you have to all kind of be on the same page as far as what we want. And not in the work we're doing, but out of the life that we're living. This is kind of a collective ambition. Matter of fact, these are the terms that Jeff uses, the guy who wrote about team flow. Then we have to have a common goal. That is the thing we're working on. Our personal goals have to align with the team goal. So if you see a really great rock and roll band or whatever, you're going to see a lot of this there. They have the collective ambition of being a band. the common goal of the music that they're doing, the kind of music they're doing, and their aligned personal goals. That means we normally don't have 6 bass players in a rock and
Right.
roll band. Everybody's got their own thing that they want to do, and this comes into the high skill integration. We have all the skills we need, and it comes together in something that would hardly do, at least in performance, as a solo performer. A couple more things is you have to have open communication and safety in your communication, the psychological safety. None of these things are easy to achieve. But if we have a mutual commitment to work well with each other, we can potentially achieve these things. And that flow is what we felt we were attaining. And when we were afraid we were losing the psychological flow that you get as an individual, but I don't think we were completely eliminating that. So I may have taken us a bit off topic.
No,
no. So this is
I
the thing.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, I just love that once you kind of achieve these conditions, then the homing mechanism for continuous improvement just kind of takes off naturally.
That's right.
Whereas if you come in top down and say, oh, use, I don't know, retrospectives to continuous improve, like it doesn't achieve the same effect as if you set those conditions in place. Naturally, continuous improvement will happen. I think
Yes.
like Taiichi Ono, right, the legendary Toyota production system guy, and I'll paraphrase, I'm going to butcher this, but he's like, standard work is the process, the systematized process for achieving greatness in work. And if what you're doing, I think he said 6 months, 6 months now, hence is the same thing that you're doing now in the, in the future is doing the thing you're doing now. You're not doing standardized work is what he effectively called his version of software teaming in his thing. So it's like,
I like that.
It's really a cool adaptation to the niche of software engineering, right?
Anyway. This is, I don't know if I can spot them here, but I have recently dug out all of my old Lean books because I was reading Lean stuff back in the 90s,
Yeah.
which I think Agile partly grew out of. I worked at a place in the 70s that was, as far as I can recall, basically following what we came to call Lean. They had a one-piece flow. They were a manufacturer of musical instruments. They had a one-piece flow. Nothing was made till a customer ordered something, and then it was made as directly as possible. You would get cards, so it's a Kanban signaling idea. And in my little part of the company, I made the resonators for banjos and did a couple other things. And so I would get a card and it's got to do this thing about walnut with this sort of inlay, and I would make that. And about the time I was done, it was the banjo was ready to. Well, the work had to be finished. They had to take it to a spray painting booth or whatever, but then it was ready to be assembled. So within a week of something being ordered or whatever, it was kind of made. It was pretty amazing to watch this process. Well, I didn't know what was going on. I was just part of something I was working there, and so to speak. No, actually, nobody actually worked there. We all were independent contractors in charge of our own space, which made it quite cool. Anyway, once I experienced that and I went on to, own my own businesses that I did after that, I always tried to achieve that, tried to figure out what was it we were doing. And then when the book started coming out, the very earliest ones that I got, I remember I've got a book here on Kanban, which was probably written in 1988 or something like that. And, I started reading these books and go, okay, now this is close. It got me to the point where as I experimented with it, in my own business, I realized that I was spending way too much time managing things. And for me, the business I was in, which was graphics design, signage manufacturing, advertising kind of stuff, I was interested in the things we were doing, not in the managing of people. So it was really cool to me to see a system where you didn't necessarily need to be managing anyone. And we came up along with the people that were working in the company with mechanisms for them to self-manage. And this is why I think I got attracted to Agile when Agile came along, because I think it was about the same kind of level of respect for the people that are doing the work. And I got to say, I know that I turned into a boss I would never want to have worked for. And this was the part of my time trying to reclaim my sanity and my humanity. And maybe I've never really done that, or reclaimed it, but that's part of what I was trying to do.
Interesting. Yeah. So I know that last decade or so, you've been really busy just traversing the globe, helping teach and educate, and more than that,
Yes.
practice some of these software teaming concepts. And do you know, when did you lose count? Like, how many countries and continents have you been in?
Yeah.
I just have to ask, like, because you've been on a really uh, explicit mission to bring this to the world, and yeah, I'd just love to hear more about that journey.
Well, my main compulsion was that if people asked, then I would help. So that's something I'd learned years earlier, is that if you're the one who can help, then you have to help. And that's what in doing anything. And I got lots of examples of that I can give from people that I admired in my own life. Like if an emergency happens, the people that step up. And I remember, we lived at the bottom of a long downhill road out in the countryside when I was a little kid. And people would come down that at night and their brakes would go out and they'd have an automobile accident at the bottom of the hill. And, I remember my dad would jump up out of bed and run to the street to help in his pajamas, or he'd grab his pants, off the rack and run out there with his pants not even on yet. He'd got to put them on over his pajama bottoms or whatever. You just step up and help when you are the one who's there to help. And so as soon as people started asking, and matter of fact, the very first conference I gave a talk on this specifically was Agile 2012 in Grapevine, Texas. And people were coming up to me and saying, "What's this mob programming thing everyone's talking about?" And I said, "Well, who's talking about that?" "Well, everybody says you got to go talk to Woody." So after the first 2 or 3 times I explained this to someone, I realized I can't stand here all day just explaining the same things over and over to whoever comes up and asks. And literally, over a dozen, probably 15 to 20 people had come up and asked me about this. So they used to have this thing they called the open jam, where you could get on stage impromptu, just select a slot yourself in and do an open stage talk. And 20 people showed up for that talk. So that was my first official talk. And I realized at that moment that I don't know what to say about this. I sent an email to my crew back at Hunter, said, "Can you make me one of those Letterman style lists, like 15 reasons this is a good thing?"
Okay.
And they did that for me, and they sent it. I said, "Take some photos of our work area. I'll show those." And then as soon as it was done, I got about 10 questions. I wrote those down. And I thought, I got to be able to answer these questions in my talk. And I kept doing that over the next many years, even up to this day. If I get a question that I didn't cover, that I should have covered, I write it down and I study it and try and figure out how could I address that question. The 2 first questions were, what's the right number of people to have on a team? Which I think is not a useful question, but it's one I frequently get asked. It's not about the number of people. It has nothing to do with a number. And the other thing is, how can you possibly be productive with 5 or 6 people at one computer? And that's one I really wanted to be able to answer. And my first answer was, gee, I don't know. We just are. So, I'm just telling you what we're doing. I'm not telling you the science of it. I've since tried to drill it into myself. And you can see here, I've read something like 30 books on teamwork. And there's many different ways to do teamwork. The best teams sometimes don't even get along with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I can't tell you what's the best way to have a team or to do a team. And teams can be anywhere from a few people to 100 people or more, probably. So, yeah, I can't answer these things. But what I noticed is that once I would give a talk, I would get invited to go give more talks. And but even in 2012, I don't know when the Agile conference is. I think it was in August that year. I got invited to speak at a conference up in San Francisco that same year, right after, like maybe October. And then I realized I got to learn how to talk about this stuff. And I started gathering the knowledge to be able to speak with some. And how did this happen to us? Why did it happen to us?
Right.
And I will tell, if anybody's interested, I think there's one thing I want to make clear. In 2009, I had pretty much been working within companies where I was trying to get change to happen, but I wasn't in charge of making the changes happen. I was just trying to influence the changes. And I decided from that point on, I'm not going to work at a place unless they're ready to do the kinds of changes they wish that they could have. And so in 2009, I started doing that. I got a great job right after that in a place where they were ready to make a difference. And then I moved on to the next one, which was, I was looking for a bigger place, and that was Hunter, where they had a team that was not doing well, and they wanted someone really to guide them along. And that's where mob programming really came to what it would be. Yeah, I didn't know how to explain any of this. I knew how to explain the basics of agile stuff,
Sure.
and the basics of things like Kanban and iterations and all the things that really make steering possible. That's where I
Yep.
really landed, is if you do things that make it possible for you to steer towards the best results that you could hope for, that's what a lot of these things are about. How do we steer to the good stuff?
Yeah. I I want to kind of just come back to the international travels thing for
Yeah,
just a
sure,
second,
sure.
and one thing I just interject a very small anecdote here. I was asked, I think it's maybe 2016 or something, to come speak at a conference called Go Digital that was in Iceland, and they were like, "Yeah, come on, and here you will give you a full day workshop slot," and they're like, "Pick a workshop." Well, this is my peak, test driven development, mob programming era. So I'm like, how about TDD and mobbing? Right. And I set them up with a few constraints, just like you described with software teaming, and said, we're going to use Driver Navigator, and here's how it works. And we're also going to follow a kind of red green refactor, kind of the Kent Beck lifestyle of test driven development. And I got the group started. And in 5 minutes, they switched to Icelandic. Now, I do not speak Icelandic, and I do not know how the rest of the workshop went, other than everyone seemed very happy and they invited me to have a drink with them afterwards. So I assume it went really well, and it was good vibes, right? So I think it was like the easiest workshop I've ever done in terms of my effort. I would just have little side conversations with, in English with people that were not in the rotation or were just wanted to talk. And I'm curious, like, are there cultural or regional differences? I know this may be a tricky question that you've observed. Like, are there? Yeah, I'm just curious. As a fellow globetrotter, like, how do different ways of life, how does this approach different ways of life in different groups of people that maybe have different beliefs and biases and upbringings?
Yeah, that's a kind of a tough one. Overall, my experience so far has been people are the same everywhere. I have not
Okay.
seen great differences in their ability to work well as a team, and I've seen nothing get in the way of that. In their actual day-to-day work, that may be differently. They may not be allowed to work as a team, or they may not be allowed to have 5 people sitting at one computer or whatever it happens to be. In some cultures, you pretty much cannot counter your boss at all, and in other cultures, you're expected to counter your boss. So there's lots of different, there's cultural differences. But first of all, I do encourage, when they're coding, I encourage them to speak whatever language there is useful to them as a team. And in some situations, they're all going to speak English because they're from too many different cultures and their common language is English. But I'm pretty sure, and from what I've read and learned, we think more clearly in our native tongue,
Yep.
and we will never have as much experience programming or with any other language, probably, as we had in the first 6 or 7 years of our life in our native tongue. So I encourage that, and I will always tell them, you don't have to worry about me being here. I'll catch on to what's going on. It's not a big deal. And I have done workshops on every continent except for Antarctica. If anybody has a company in Antarctica and they'd like to have me do a workshop, I have a feeling that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So, but I would jump at that chance. But yeah, and everywhere I go, the people were excited to be learning to work as a team. But I got to make it clear, software teaming or mob programming exists only because I noticed in software, when we were put on a team, we didn't do anything like a team. And I
Right.
wondered about that, and I saw the benefits of it. So it wasn't like people often say, well, can you take these same practices to other kinds of work? And they say, well, yeah, but I actually have a series of photographs because in our early research, we were trying to determine what industries do they do teamwork in. And we have pictures. I think at one time I had 1,000 pictures of people working as a team outside of software development. And I've taken videos. I've watched construction crews and I've watched road crews and things like that working as a team. So it was just unusual, and it caught my attention almost immediately. You're on this team. I sit in the same general area, but I never do anything like a team. It's like we have 6 solo people working in the same area on basically the same stuff. That's not team. Is team better? Not necessarily. Teamwork does not replace solo work. Solo work does not replace teamwork. We got to be good at both. There's no reason that we shouldn't become good at both. But at some point in all the work that we do, we must interact with others. So we can do an experiment. There's one thing that I've encouraged people. If you say, no, we need to work alone, then all I ask them is, as soon as you need to contact another person, note that down. Because that's a signal that you're ignoring. It's telling you, maybe I should be working with that other person.
Yeah.
Whenever we have to send an email to get an answer to a question, watch how much work it takes to get that answer the way you need it, to communicate the question the way you need to get the answer you need, and how many round trips you need to do before you land on the thing you actually needed. I think there's a lot of reason to learn to work together.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that, especially for if any of our clients or people that we work with and you're experiencing problems with like dependency management, or you're looking at countermeasures like work in progress limits and stuff like that. The approach that Woody you've kind of taken bakes that into the approach as like one of those fundamental conditions. It's like you have a WIP limit. It's called 1.
That's right.
We're working on the most important thing, right? You have dependency management because you've invited people into the group, the pod, the team,
That's right.
whatever, to kind of answer those questions real time and not have to create delay conditions. So like rather than trying to patch on a bunch of process discipline, you're just baking it into the way of working, which to me is brilliant.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of benefits to working this way. And it's to just rattle them off here would be useless. But I did a study last year where I was asked to give a talk on the impact of mob programming over the last 10 years, because I really started traveling internationally in 2013, sharing this all over the world. And so I went on YouTube. I searched for conference talks on mob programming or software teaming or ensemble programming. It's called all these things and other things. And I got a list of them, about 20 or 30 almost instantly. And I think if I would have kept digging, I would have found another 50. I watched all 20 or 30 of those. And I took notes from each one. I took the transcripts because YouTube, hopefully I can say YouTube. I'm advertising Google here. I took their transcripts from each one, threw that into ChatGPT and said, sort through this stuff. And here's the benefits that the list of benefits that we had observed and others had observed. Do any of these conference talks address any of these things? Almost every talk mentioned every item on that list. I had a list of like 15 things. One of the benefits is we get amplified learning, and I think that's one of the biggest values here. That's why even to this moment, I think it's important to work as a team. The amplified learning. Just last night or night before, I did a session with some folks that we're all wanting to learn to do some game programming stuff. And I learned as much as I would have learned in the previous month about this, I learned in a night working with other people. So it's really amplified learning. But what are the other benefits? We were getting a lot more done, but there's something very much more important than that. And this was shared with me by somebody who's a consultant that was working at one of the big airlines recently. He said their productivity indicators went down when they started mob programming, but the value of the stuff they were creating was going up. What they had discovered was previously, everybody would take on stuff they could easily get done because that would look like they were being productive. Well, that stuff was the stuff that didn't matter. The stuff that mattered wasn't getting done. So we measure the wrong things. We incentivize for the wrong things. We measure the wrong things. So that's another benefit. We were getting more done, but it was more of the stuff that really mattered. Once we got good at it, on our original team, our productivity just shot through the roof. We were literally getting 10 times as many things done, but that's easy to do when the team was previously not getting much done at all. So, yeah, this is just the thing. The other benefits are we get to know each other and we get to learn how to fill in the gaps for each other. Where someone's weak, someone else is strong. Where someone is really knowledgeable, they can guide the rest of the team, and the rest of the team becomes more knowledgeable. I read somewhere one of the famous basketball coaches saying that your job as a star on a team is to help everyone else be a star on the team. And I like that kind of a thing. So, yeah. And I could go on. If you want to go back to the international stuff, there is a couple things we could share if you're interested.
Go for it.
When I first got invited to speak on this, it was at the Dev conference in Malmo, Sweden. Malmo, you've been to that probably.
Yeah.
It's a great conference. It was a great conference. And they had sent me an email saying, hey, or maybe it was a note in Twitter saying, hey, these topics you're talking about, no estimates and mob programming, we want you to talk about those at our conference. And I sent back a note saying, I'd love to, but I can't afford to take a week off and fly myself and all the expenses. No, you'll get paid for this and we'll cover all your expenses and don't worry about anything. So I said, okay. And then almost immediately at the same time, I got an email from a big I don't know what you would call them, Ericsson in Sweden. And they said, hey, could you come do a workshop on mob programming at our company? And I said, I happen to be getting invited to a conference. Could we do it at the same time? I'd never done a workshop, hardly at all, and certainly not one on mob programming. And so I had to learn how to do that. But that one conference led to dozens of invites to speak at other conferences. So starting in 2013, I had to turn down most invitations because I was working full time. I was able to tried to go to one a month, mostly the ones that were nearby here in the US. But within a couple of years, I actually made the decision to leave Hunter. There were several reasons, but one was there was just too much interest in mob programming for me to ignore being able to talk about it. So I worked on the workshop, and the workshop framework that the guys at Ericsson helped me put together is basically what I still follow today. Give an intro of what it is, help them learn a little of the ins and outs of sitting together as a team, and then we go to actually doing some coding exercises. And at the end, I try to give a talk on why do I think this works. And that's the same basic pattern I've been following since then. Just nice. Maybe improving it over time. If anybody's really interested in speaking, becoming a speaker, my only advice or maybe opinion is that if you have something you're really interested in and people want to hear about it, then you will have opportunities. I think trying to figure out what people are going to be interested in isn't something I know about. I cannot tell you what people would want to hear about. I just share the things that I knew about, and I got invited to speak.
It has to come from within, and that's how I started. I was really passionate about domain-driven design, and I started with a glorified book report because I made it through the Blue Book, and and then that turned into how we were applying it, and it got more interesting from there. But I was able to carry those initial momentum with just passion, and
that's powerful.
It really does. It does make a difference. I wanna shift over to maybe kind of more present state and what's going on right now in the industry. Obviously, the only thing that really seems to get any attention or funding these days has to do with AI stuff. And, there's a kind of irony in the way I see engineers approaching AI. I'm seeing them talk about very familiar things, like baby steps, like keeping LLMs on short leashes, I don't know, test first. And all these things feel very reminiscent of extreme programming. They also feel, the interaction model of being like a strong style navigator to the driver, which is the LLM, which is a kind of sometimes haphazard, getting better kind of driver, is also, that irony doesn't escape me, is someone that's been pushing the boulder up the hill for a long time on these techniques like software teaming, like pair programming, stuff like that. I got a little cynicism and a little bit of hope, maybe equal measure, around maybe the kids are all right, but it's like they seem to be willing to do this chatting and working with a robot much more than they are with other people. I know I'm dumping a lot on you here, but I mean,
no, but this is great stuff.
Yeah.
This is very, very pertinent. It's, up to the minute stuff. The first thing is that mob programming was essentially about staying at the higher level as the navigators on the team can be thinking about the problem space and the solution space rather than the details. And my very first really good pair programming experiences had shown me that we do have a division of concerns when we pair program. If we're doing driver navigator style, we have one person that's deep in the weeds, another person who's able to think at the higher level. And this separation really makes for a great pairing, a great way of working. And this is when that really finally hit me, I realized, man, this is why this works so well, is that we're not constantly context switching. When you work alone, you are always context switching between the problem and the details, or in between that is the solution. This is what I want to try now. That context switching is probably not as useful as we tend to act it is, because act as it is. We tend to keep our hands on the keyboard or whatever and learn to type really quickly, or people have highly programmed keyboards where they get to do, all kinds of shortcut trips. I've known people who have gotten really good at getting their ideas in the computer quickly, but I still think that the disconnect is there. We are context switching constantly when we're doing that. Now, that's just an observation. I don't mean to ever be saying this is a truth.
Right.
This is just what it seems like to me. So I think we were learning to do prompting. The navigating was the prompting. We say, okay, what we need is a drop down with all the regions. And when somebody selects a region, it'll show them some options. Well, there's the high level thing. And if the person's getting the details of putting a drop down on the page and they're having trouble, well, somebody on the team helps them through that. But if they're getting it, then we're thinking ahead a little bit. We're always able to be thinking the next step, and that keeps us rolling along rather nicely. And of course, we have 5 sets of eyes or more on the code, many different perspectives on how to do things. One of our guidelines was if somebody has an idea they want to try, we will try it. So this is part of the collective ambition and the common goal. The commitment to each other from the team flow stuff is we're willing to try everyone's ideas. You don't need to be very insistent. You can just say, I think I'd like to try this. And the rest of the team jumps on it and says, let's do it. So we fulfill the intent of every person. We found that really amplified the learning. So now that we get into AI, I don't see anything's really should change. A lot of people will just stick with being solo with this, and I don't see any reason you can't do this as a team. And I actually have a talk that I've been giving with a partner that I've been working with, James Hare, who's he's a mob programming fan and does a lot of AI work in his work. And we put together a talk basically on teaming or mob programming or ensemble. We call it different things depending on the audience. And AI, how does this work? And there's a lot of nuances and a lot of pitfalls, and there's things we need to be thinking about. But I would argue that that AI has a level of importance we haven't even begun to understand yet. It's going to move along faster than we can keep up with it, and that is that the AI itself will be moving itself along. We won't be able to keep up with it. And it's possible it will learn how to trick us into thinking we're getting what we want out of it in our actual end results. So yeah, there's a lot to be concerned with here, but there's no reason we shouldn't be learning how to use it well. I know people are using it well, and I have seen research that shows people are getting things done more directly and rapidly, but I do believe that we are also not necessarily getting the right things done. Yeah. I've done a fair amount of creating software with AI, and I think that's sort of the wrong focus. I don't think, my brother Fred, I think. He had something he said to me the other day that we took a walk earlier. It's earlier this week, but we were taking a walk, and he said, well, I think I use AI a lot. And he says, I think of it as being a rather faulty, somewhat moderately skilled collaboration partner. So I kind of like that because you can't trust anything you're getting, but he's using it differently than most people I see using it. I think that our focus being on it's going to create software for us. I think we're just at the beginning stages of this. Yeah, I've seen a lot of stuff written by AI, and I see it as being, we get the instant, as Joe Yoder and Brian Foote wrote about the big ball of mud 25 years ago, we get
Right.
an instant big ball of mud.
Right.
So the big ball of mud is the architectural pattern that almost all projects that live for more than for a year or two devolve into. A hodgepodge of things that the architecture is no longer what we originally intended, because what we originally intended didn't actually fulfill what was needed. And as different people work on it, it gets worse and worse. I think we get an instant big ball of mud. And there's many, many other problems. We won't go into details of that here, but with the way code is being generated through AI.
I mean, I think it comes back to the learning thing you were mentioning. Software teaming being really a learning, and it for sure has that's upskilling kind of effect of like,
Right.
you're gonna develop your skills. You're gonna kind of flatten the skill curve like on a team, but also if you just push the pedal to the metal on code gen. One thing I observed very quickly in my experiments, and I'm making a lot of use out of it and spend a lot of money on AI tokens and stuff like that. But one of the things I learned is I kind of coined this term learning debt. It's like, okay, it's like the new technical debt. It's just a form of that. It's like, okay, this thing I built, I don't understand the 3 hugging face models that it pulled down, and I don't understand these 7 libraries, and I don't understand these language constructs. And like, it really becomes almost a runaway train, like, or that big ball of mud going down the steepest, biggest hill in the
Right.
neighborhood, really quickly, unless you kind of inject that rigor. And like, as far as rigor and discipline, I know of no other way than to create an accountability circle around me that works better. If we agree to say we were going to kind of try to attempt to understand our code as it evolves, that's going to be a natural dampening effect on our accelerator, right? We're going to slow down a little bit and make sure we're taking time to understand what goes in and vet it, and at least keep up with it to a degree. So I don't know, maybe my views will, strong opinions weakly held, maybe they'll change in a few years, but I'm still very mindful of that. Pushing that lever, pushing that gas pedal down isn't always the best idea. You also want to have control of the vehicle,
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking of it. So we've gone through these transitions, transformations, whatever, over the time of technology. If we go back into my first learning to do programming, there were 2 steps to it. The first was the industry I was in, which was creating advertising graphics, mostly for signage, but also for print and other things like that. It was clear that industry there was going to be software people would use and hardware, to create, the CAD CAM kind of stuff, as they used to say, computer aided manufacturing. And I had gotten myself trained to be a sign painter and a designer of these things. And I could see this is going to, we won't have sign painters in a few years. That's the one time in my life that I think I was able to predict the future. Pretty much most in the US, at least, and in most parts of the world I've been to, there's very little people doing hand painting of signs anymore. And I thought I better learn about computers. So I bought a CAD CAM system that would do some specific things I needed to do. And I bought a general use computer, an Osborne. And I learned to use them. And pretty quickly, I realized that the software in these things is terrible. And my wife, who's got a great sense of humor, said, somebody is making a lot of money writing really terrible software. She said, I bet you could learn to write really terrible software too. And so I think that that's a very wise thing. And so I thought, okay, yeah, some of the things I wanted, we paid a lot of money for the software and it didn't really work. It would crash and it was problematic. I started teaching myself to program. So this is not very undifferent from what we're seeing with AI. And this happened 3 or 4 times across, the software industry. You don't buy CDs, you don't buy encyclopedia on a CD anymore. There are lots of things change over time. And the internet changed a lot of things. Phones, graphical user interfaces changed a lot of things. Things will keep changing. If people get to the point where they're creating the software we need purely by defining it in a different way than we currently have been defining it to the computer, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's very little different than, I remember that one of the first computery things I used, you would flip switches and hit a button and would put something into a memory location. Then you would flip some switches, hit another button, and you do simple math or something. pretty quickly, people started using punch cards. That's before my time, really, and eventually got to these text-based programming languages. But those are just steps on the way to whatever the future will be. Just because we currently have text-based computer programming languages that we need to understand doesn't mean that's what we'll have next year or 5 years from now. Why do we need that? Why should we have code that's written in Java? What does that mean? What do programming languages mean? The programming languages will probably stop being meaningful. I'm just throwing ideas out there, but
No, the level of abstraction's moving up, but where it's the ceiling that it's hitting are the kind of communication skills that a software teaming environment really puts on the fast track. Things like communication, storytelling, working with empathy, articulating what you want.
right.
And then some of those good XP practices really do help you get better outcomes with this stuff. So I think that's my cynicism is like, oh, now you want a pair program, but it's tempered very much by like wanting to be the cranky old man in the room, but also being like, that's cool. Like you're using this, it's found another life, and it still works, and it's like a principle that is enduring, and then
Yes.
these kind of crazy times of change, I like to hang on to those. Those are my little handles, that I can hang on to stay sane. Yeah.
So certain principles will never change. So, the Agile had their idea of the values and principles. Some principles will never change. But some will modify or change. Practices change frequently. I used to think of it this way, is that the practices we use are ever evolving rapidly. The principles don't evolve so quickly. And if they do, they really stay within a general sameness. I made for myself my list of guidelines when I first started trying to communicate Agile stuff to people. And one of them is, our code has to be easy to work on or it will turn into a nightmare. That wasn't really the exact saying, but it's got to be easy to maintain and easy to discard, easy to read and so on. Well, maybe that is going to change because we may not be looking at code much longer. Code in the form that we think of it may not be, it is going to change to a different level of abstraction. Maybe. The best talks that I've seen a couple dozen, maybe more, live talks at conferences, really trying to figure this stuff out for myself. The best talks were people who did something practical, but it is always a throwback to me that they're just creating some kind of code generation system. And I'm not sure that's the right space we should be looking at. Maybe I'm wrong. Probably I'm wrong. Let's say that differently. Probably I'm wrong. I like to point this out. When I was first shown a mouse, a computer mouse, I said, that's a silly idea. Who's going to take their hand off the keyboard to use a pointing device? Come on. Well, I was quickly proven wrong with that.
Yeah.
And that goes with so many things. Yeah. Don't take my forecast for the future anything more than just a little hint at maybe something to think about.
I think we can develop coping mechanisms for the future by mining the past,
Yes,
and I think that's always been my reason for reading history and looking at other things that go on. It's like, what can I learn from that I can apply contemporarily?
That's a really good point. We can learn from history, and we should be.
Yeah.
The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera.
Right. Yeah.
And but we're here to be flexible enough to adjust and so on. We can't predict the future, but we can be prepared for the things that come along.
Yeah, I like it. All right, I got one. Dude, I could talk to you all day long, but I'm not. I know that's not humane, and I know that
Our poor listeners.
and we're probably, and I would love to just have you back. I mean, I think we could.
Sure.
We could talk. I'd love to check in with you when the storytelling thing. I do want to kind of go out with this and understanding, like you threw out on LinkedIn a couple weeks back around that I don't consider myself a great communicator, which I believe your sincerity, but you're wrong, right? Or a great storyteller. I think you are well above average, and I've really enjoyed your stories, like in your conference talks and in our private conversations. But you said you're working on a storytelling workshop with your partner, and I also work with my partner too. So I think that's an interesting dynamic to explore is like working with your significant other. But I just kind of like to know, like, where's your work in progress there? What are you thinking for that storytelling workshop? I would sign me up when it's available, but I'm just kind
Well,
of, yeah,
the first thing that I think I will do is just I view these free sessions once a month or a couple times a month on different topics I'm interested in learning about. And that's probably where I'll start. I'll do a session where I'll just say, hey, here's the things we're thinking about. Let's break off into small groups and move this thing along. And usually I'll have a little bit of something I'll talk about, and then I'll have some kind of an exercise thing to discuss, sort of control. And then we come back and do a lessons learned, or what did we discover. So I'll probably do many of those first before I ever try to do this as something I would be doing at a conference. I'm going to do several of those, and I'm not guaranteeing this is going to follow through. I have 4 or 5 topics I've done where I got into the middle of them. I'm going, this isn't really gelling into something I feel I need to pursue. But this is similar to mob programming. I've had so many people tell me, I'd like to learn to tell stories. And I think that that's an important thing. We all have important things to talk about. And the things that happen to us can be turned into stories. We don't need to tell everything about something that happened to us, or maybe we need to embellish it, and we just need to be honest about what we're doing. But I think that there's a path we can go down there, and other people are probably already doing things like this. But it's something that's interesting to both me and my wife. And she is really good at telling stories. And the way she goes about doing it, because she writes these children's books, which are picture books. And a picture book, the story is really told in the pictures. The words are there to set up the pictures, the humor or whatever, or the punchline or the result of the pictures. And so I've tried to capture some of that from her. But when she's writing a story, she spends a lot of time with the main character, drawing it. And she will draw that character not just hundreds, but thousands of times. And as she draws that character, it becomes a living, I'm paraphrasing here, it becomes a living thing to her. It's no longer just a little drawing. It's a drawing she's intimately interacted with to the degree that she knows a lot about this, whatever it happens to be. And so that is part of this process, and everybody's going to be different. Some people they're just illustrators. Someone brings them a story, and they illustrate the story. And
yeah,
with my wife, it's kind of like she does some illustrations, and if a story rises up out of it. Matter of fact, where she started, and maybe this is a good place to end, she was an artist. She's always been doing art things, and sometime 2006 or 7, she was doing drawings. She was selling through Etsy and at little art fairs and stuff. And people would come up and say, "Oh, what book is that picture from?" Or "What book is that from?" She goes, "These are just pictures." And each one was different. And people would say, "Well, I'd like to know the story of that picture." And she started realizing, maybe I need to illustrate children's books. So she got a portfolio together, found somebody who, at one of the big book conferences, people look at the portfolios of different artists who they might want to use. Somebody who was an agent asked her if she could represent her. And so this company started representing Andrea, and they told her it would be much easier if you wrote the stories, and we could just take the story and some pictures to a publisher. So they guided her into writing one of her stories down. And now she writes, I don't know how many she's done, 10 or 12 or whatever, over the last 10 years, like a book a year. And she's got one that she just finished. I can't tell you anything about it. That is just absolutely marvelous. The publisher came back immediately and said, can you do a series of these? Now, that's not right for her. A series is like when she's done with something, she's done with it. But anyways, right. This is part of it. That we all have a story to tell. How that story comes out of this is going to be different. And for people like you and I, a lot of times our stories are there to help people get an understanding of something. And that's the purpose of our stories. And all the stories that I tell when I give talks are crafted over a long period of time. And if I had to put a story together out of the blue, that's what I'm trying to learn to do. I got to express this thing. How can I develop a full story for that to use in my work? Whereas before they naturally evolved, and maybe that's all I'll ever get.
Yeah, it's you're fishing. I was going to ask you who you consider to be a great storyteller, but I think you answered that. I think you live with that person.
Well,
Since
there we
I'm very,
go.
yeah. So
So I knew
that's
some
great.
great storytellers when I was young. The men and it was always men in the public meetings and stuff that I would go to as a kid, different Boy Scouts or church
Yep.
or business things and stuff. There were guys there that just were unbelievable storytellers. They could just draw everybody in. And so I wish I could be like that.
Yeah.
And that they
Yeah.
would draw everybody in. And I remember things when important decisions had to be made. Things were framed in stories and
Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
It is 100% a career marketable skill, and I'll tell you one niche where, when you get a little closer, just look me up, but the or hit me up, but the product management, is storytelling. The great product managers have this skill where they can, I mean, in very quick session telling a story, bring people on board with the vision and the customer pains and what's happening. Whereas the ones that really struggle tend to be a little bit more mechanical requirements driven. And
Yes,
that's a
yes.
broad generalization, no doubt about it. But I think I've kind of looked at that skill as something that's a real gap, and it's a recognized gap amongst leadership. So I don't know. I just think that might be a very adjacent audience. You already used to working with product people. They could use some tips and tricks and some deliberate practice to kind of get better with this stuff. So I
Yeah,
think it's a really neat.
that's a good point. Well, who knows what the future holds? I know for myself right now, I've watched there's a I think a real drop in the need for the kinds of trainings that I've done in the past. And right now I'm considering, what am I going to do going forward? I still have clients and I still have people who want to do workshops. It's a little bit more difficult to get things finalized right now than it has been in the past. So whether I want to continue, I got into this by accident in the first
Yeah.
place. People will tell us about mob programming, so I had to learn how to do it. And maybe the time for talking about mob programming is over. I don't know. And so, yeah, my feeling overall is I love what I'm doing, but it's not defining what I need to be doing. I have
Nice.
been really loving AI and doing AI stuff just for different things, trying to learn how to get these tools to do anything that's meaningful to me.
Yeah. Well, Woody, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to chat with me. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I'll go
My
ahead and
pleasure.
invite you back sometime in the future. How about
Absolutely.
that? All right.
Absolutely.
Thanks again, Woody.
Thank you so much.